The morning of February 3, 1945, Albert Speer stood at the window of his ministry building in central Berlin, watching the sky. The air raid sirens had begun their familiar wail at dawn. Speer had heard them hundreds of times before. Berlin had been bombed repeatedly since 1940. The city's residents had learned to recognize the different patterns, the night raids by the British, the occasional daylight strikes by the Americans. But this morning felt different. The drone of engines was louder, deeper, more persistent than anything Speer had experienced. He watched as the first formations appeared, silver specks catching the winter sunlight. Then more formations. Then more. The sky darkened with aircraft. Speer counted the bomber groups aloud, then stopped counting. There were too many. Nearly 1,000 American B-17 flying fortresses were approaching Berlin, escorted by approximately 1,000 fighter aircraft. The largest daylight raid on the German capital in history. The formations stretched for miles, layer upon layer of four-engine bombers moving in tight defensive boxes. Each bomber carried 3,000 pounds of high explosive and incendiary bombs. The mathematics were simple and devastating. 3 million pounds of ordnance was about to fall on a city where Speer himself was standing. He turned to his staff and said something that would later be recorded in his memoirs. "The war is over." The officer beside him looked confused. The Eastern Front was still hundreds of kilometers away. German armies still held positions across Western Europe. The Wehrmacht had just launched a major offensive in the Ardennes 2 months earlier. By what measure was the war over? Speer gestured at the sky. "Look at them. A year ago we shot down 69 American bombers when they tried this. Today they came with 1,000 bombers and 1,000 fighters, and we cannot touch them. The Americans can do this every day. We cannot rebuild faster than they can destroy. The war is over. We have simply not admitted it yet." This realization, this moment of clarity about German defeat visible in the winter sky over Berlin, came nearly 4 years too late to matter. The question that haunted German military leadership after the war was not whether they would lose, but why they had failed to recognize what men like Speer saw so clearly in February 1945. The answer involves a series of miscalculations so profound that they border on institutional delusion. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story begins not in Berlin but in the industrial cities of the Ruhr Valley, where German generals first encountered American air power and dismissed what they saw. In 1943, when the United States Army Air Forces began flying deep penetration raids into Germany, the German High Command watched with professional interest and private contempt. General Adolf Galland, inspector of fighters for the Luftwaffe, represented the confident assessment shared by most German military leaders. Galland was a combat veteran, a fighter ace with 70 victories by mid-1943. He had fought in Spain over France during the Battle of Britain. He understood air warfare as well as any man in the German military. When American bomber formations first appeared over German airspace in 1943, Galland and his fellow officers noted several facts that seemed to confirm German superiority. The American bombers flew in daylight, making themselves visible to German fighters and anti-aircraft guns. They flew in rigid formations that limited their ability to maneuver. They relied on mutual defensive fire from their machine guns rather than on speed or altitude for protection. German fighters attacked these formations and inflicted severe losses. On August 17, 1943, American bombers struck the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. The raid was intended to cripple German industrial production. Instead, it nearly crippled the American bomber force. 60 bombers were shot down out of 230 that participated. Another 122 returned with battle damage. German newspapers proclaimed a great victory. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, assured Hitler that American daylight bombing was unsustainable. The Americans would either stop deep penetration raids or switch to night bombing like the British. Either way, the threat was manageable. When the Americans attacked Schweinfurt again on October 14, 1943, German fighters shot down 60 bombers out of 291, more than 20% of the attacking force. The Americans suspended deep penetration raids for 5 months. To German analysts, this confirmed their assessment. American bomber crews lacked the courage to sustain such losses. American commanders lacked the competence to develop better tactics. The whole concept of strategic daylight bombing was a failed experiment. This analysis was not entirely wrong. It was simply incomplete. German intelligence correctly identified what was happening but failed to project what would happen next. They saw American weaknesses in October 1943. They did not anticipate American adaptations by February 1944. The critical variable was fighter escorts. In 1943, American fighters had insufficient range to accompany bombers deep into Germany. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the primary escort fighter, could reach targets in western Germany but had to turn back before bombers reached industrial targets in the Reich's interior. German fighters waited for the escorts to leave, then attacked the undefended bomber formations with devastating effect. German fighter tactics in 1943 focused on the brief window when bombers were unescorted. Galland's pilots developed techniques specifically designed to destroy four-engine heavy bombers. Twin-engine fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 110 carried heavy cannons and rockets capable of destroying a B-17 with a single hit. Single-engine fighters attacked from head-on, exploiting the B-17's weaker frontal armament. These tactics worked brilliantly against unescorted bombers. They would prove catastrophic against bombers with long-range fighter protection. But in late 1943, long-range fighter escorts seemed technologically impossible. The distances involved were too great. No single-engine fighter had the fuel capacity to fly from England to Berlin and back while engaging in combat. This was the assumption that would destroy the Luftwaffe. In February 1944, the North American P-51 Mustang entered service with the United States 8th Air Force in significant numbers. The Mustang, equipped with external drop tanks, had a combat radius exceeding 500 miles. It could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and return to England with fuel to spare. More importantly, the P-51 could outperform German fighters in almost every category. It was faster than the Messerschmitt Bf 109. It had superior range to the Focke-Wulf 190. Could fight effectively at all altitudes. American fighter pilots quickly realized they no longer needed to stay close to the bomber formations. They could sweep ahead, hunting German fighters before they reached the bombers. This tactical shift transformed the air war over Germany. German fighters climbing to intercept bomber formations found themselves attacked by American fighters before they reached combat altitude. German fighters regrouping after initial attacks found American fighters waiting for them. German fighters returning to base to refuel and rearm were strafed on their own airfields. Galland recognized the problem immediately. In March 1944, he wrote a desperate assessment for the Luftwaffe High Command. Between January and April 1944, German day fighters lost over 1,000 pilots. They included the best squadron, Gruppe, and Geschwader commanders. Each American incursion was costing approximately 50 German aircrew. Galland concluded his report with a stark warning. The time has come when our weapon is in sight of collapse. Göring refused to believe him. When Galland presented evidence that American fighters had reached as far east as Aachen, deep inside German airspace, Göring dismissed it as impossible. He insisted the American fighters must have been damaged and glided eastward from great height. The suggestion that American single-engine fighters could penetrate that far into Germany contradicted everything Göring believed about air warfare. Hitler shared Göring's skepticism. The Führer's understanding of air power was limited and often bizarre. He focused obsessively on bomber production, insisting that Germany needed more bombers to retaliate against British and American cities. He showed little interest in fighter defense. When Galland tried to explain that Germany was losing the fighter war, Hitler interrupted him to discuss plans for new bomber types that existed only on paper. This disconnect between operational reality and leadership perception created a paralysis in German air defense planning. Galland and other experienced fighter commanders understood that Germany was losing control of its own airspace. They proposed emergency measures. Convert more aircraft production to fighters. Withdraw experienced pilots from other theaters to defend Germany. Develop new tactics specifically designed to counter long-range escort fighters. These proposals were rejected or implemented too slowly to matter. Bomber production continued despite the fact that German bombers accomplished almost nothing in 1944. Experienced fighter pilots remained scattered across multiple fronts defending territory that was about to be abandoned anyway. New tactics were discussed in endless meetings but never adequately tested or widely adopted. The result was a steady attrition of German fighter strength through the spring and summer of 1944. Every week, American bombers flew deeper into Germany with heavier fighter escorts. Every week, more German pilots died or were captured. The Luftwaffe was not being defeated in a single catastrophic battle. It was being ground down in hundreds of smaller engagements that individually seemed survivable but collectively were fatal. By June 1944, when the Allies landed in Normandy, the Luftwaffe could barely contest Allied air superiority over France. German ground forces, accustomed to operating with friendly air cover, found themselves completely exposed to Allied fighter bombers. American P-47 Thunderbolts and Republic P-51 Mustangs roamed freely, attacking German tanks, trucks, and troop concentrations. The Wehrmacht discovered what it felt like to fight without air support, a lesson the British Army had learned in France in 1940. Galland watched this catastrophe unfold with mounting frustration. He proposed a plan called the Big Blow, a mass concentration of German fighters that would attack a single American bomber raid with overwhelming force. The plan called for assembling 3,700 German fighters, most straight from production, for a coordinated assault that would destroy hundreds of American bombers in a single day. The plan had merit. A shock like that might force the Americans to suspend daylight bombing long enough for Germany to rebuild its fighter strength. But the plan required resources and authority that Galland no longer commanded. Hitler diverted available fighters to support the Ardennes offensive in December 1944. Göring refused to approve a plan that might result in catastrophic losses if it failed. The big blow never happened. Instead, the steady attrition continued. By January 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former strength. Experienced pilots were dead or too exhausted to continue flying. Replacement pilots received minimal training, sometimes as little as 30 hours of flight time before being sent into combat. Aircraft production continued, but there was no fuel to fly the aircraft and no pilots capable of flying them effectively. This was the situation when Albert Speer watched nearly 1,000 American bombers approach Berlin on February 3, 1945. The Luftwaffe managed to intercept with approximately 70 fighters. They shot down 21 American bombers, a respectable number in isolation but meaningless in context. The Americans could afford to lose 21 bombers. They lost more aircraft to accidents on any given week than they lost to German fighters on that day. The American bombers dropped their ordnance with unprecedented accuracy. The target was the Friedrichstrasse railway station, chosen to support Soviet ground forces approaching Berlin from the east. But the bombs fell across a wide area of central Berlin. Between 20,000 and 25,000 German civilians were killed. Another 120,000 were left homeless. Speer wrote in his diary that evening. The entry was stark. The war production of Germany will cease in 4 to 8 weeks. He had analyzed the targeting pattern of recent American raids and concluded that the Americans were systematically destroying the transportation network that connected German factories to raw materials and finished products to frontline units. Even factories that survived bombing could not operate if they could not receive coal or ship manufactured goods. Göring's reaction to the February 3rd raid was notably different from his previous responses. He did not claim a great victory. He did not promise retaliation. He simply fell silent. Galland later recalled that Göring seemed to age visibly in the months after February 1945, as if he had finally accepted what his fighter commanders had been telling him for more than a year. Hitler's reaction was more complex and more disturbing. The Führer initially refused to believe reports of the raid scale. When he finally accepted that nearly 1,000 American bombers had attacked Berlin in broad daylight, he blamed the Luftwaffe for incompetence and treachery. In staff meetings, he raged at Göring, accusing him of failing to defend the Reich. He demanded explanations for why German fighters had not destroyed the American formations. The explanations, when Göring reluctantly provided them, did not satisfy Hitler. The Americans had too many fighters. German pilots were outnumbered 8-1. The P-51 Mustang was superior to German fighters in most performance categories. Fuel shortages limited training and operations. These facts, uncomfortable as they were, described reality. Hitler rejected reality. He insisted that German fighter pilots lacked fighting spirit. He suggested that cowardice explained German losses better than material factors. He demanded that fighter pilots be subjected to military discipline more typically associated with ground combat, including execution for cowardice or failure to engage the enemy. This response revealed the fundamental problem in German strategic thinking that had persisted since the war began. German leadership, from Hitler down through the senior command structure, approached military problems through the lens of will and morale rather than through analysis of material factors. They believed that determination could overcome disadvantages in numbers, technology, or logistics. This belief had some basis in German military history. Prussia had won wars through superior organization and fighting spirit despite facing larger enemies. The Wehrmacht had conquered France in 6 weeks through audacity and operational excellence despite rough parity in equipment and numbers. These successes reinforced the conviction that morale and leadership mattered more than material superiority. But the air war over Germany demonstrated the limits of this philosophy. No amount of fighting spirit could compensate for being outnumbered 10-1. No amount of tactical brilliance could overcome fuel shortages that grounded entire fighter units. No amount of determination could replace experienced pilots who had been killed in combat. The turning point came during Big Week in February 1944. Between the 20th and 25th of that month, American and British bombers launched continuous attacks against German aircraft factories. The operation was codenamed Argument, designed to force the Luftwaffe into a decisive battle it could not win. On February 20th, 1,000 American bombers escorted by more than 600 fighters struck targets across Germany. The Luftwaffe rose to defend. German fighters attacked the bomber formations with desperate courage. They knew what was at stake. If Germany lost control of its own airspace, the war was lost. The fighting was vicious. American gunners claimed more than 500 German fighters destroyed during the week. The actual number was lower, perhaps 150 to 200, but even the conservative estimate was catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. Germany lost 1/3 of its available fighter aircraft in 6 days. More critically, it lost 17% of its fighter pilots, nearly 100 experienced airmen who could not be replaced. American losses were severe. 227 bombers were shot down. More than 5,000 American airmen were killed or captured. But the Americans could replace these losses. New bombers rolled out of factories in Kansas and California every day. New pilots completed training programs in Texas and Arizona every week. The industrial equation favored the United States by a massive margin. German fighter production actually increased through 1944. Speer's armaments ministry performed near miracles of dispersal and reorganization, moving factories into tunnels and forests, spreading production across hundreds of small workshops. Despite continuous bombing, Germany produced more fighter aircraft in 1944 than in any previous year of the war. But Germany could not produce pilots. Training time had been cut from 2 years to less than 6 months. Fuel shortages meant that student pilots received as little as 30 hours of flying time before being sent into combat. American and British pilots received more than 200 hours of training. The quality gap was enormous and getting worse. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By March 1944, American fighters began appearing over Berlin itself. This development shocked the Luftwaffe High Command. Göring had assured Hitler that enemy fighters could never reach the German capital. The distance from England to Berlin was too great. No single-engine fighter had the range. Göring's assessment was technically correct in 1939. But technology had advanced. The P-51 Mustang, equipped with external drop tanks, could escort bombers to any target in Germany and return to England. More importantly, American fighter tactics had evolved. Instead of staying close to the bombers, P-51s ranged freely, hunting German fighters wherever they could be found. The first major American raid on Berlin occurred on March 4, 1944. 730 bombers struck the German capital, escorted by 800 fighters. The Luftwaffe responded with maximum effort. Approximately 400 German fighters rose to intercept. The battle raged across German skies for hours. 69 American bombers were shot down. 160 German fighters were destroyed. The exchange rate favored the Germans tactically but was catastrophic strategically. Germany could not afford to lose 160 fighters in a single day. The Americans could afford to lose 69 bombers because they had hundreds more arriving from the United States every month. Galland recognized what was happening. In a report written in March 1944, he warned that German fighter forces were approaching collapse. Between January and April, more than 1,000 German fighter pilots had been killed or captured. These were not replacements fresh from training schools. These were squadron leaders, Gruppe commanders, and Geschwader commanders, the experienced officers who trained new pilots and led formations in combat. The report was desperate and prescient. Galland wrote that the time had come when the German fighter arm was in sight of collapse. He proposed emergency measures. Withdraw all fighters from other theaters to defend Germany. Convert bomber production entirely to fighters. Ground all training units and send their aircraft to operational squadrons. Develop new tactics specifically designed to counter long-range escort fighters. These proposals were rejected or implemented too slowly to matter. Hitler insisted on continued bomber production despite the fact that German bombers accomplished almost nothing. Fighter units remained scattered across multiple fronts. Training continued to consume fuel and aircraft that were desperately needed at the front lines. The fundamental problem was that German leadership refused to accept that they were losing. Hitler, Göring, and other senior commanders believed that will and determination would eventually prevail. They convinced themselves that American losses were unsustainable, that American public opinion would force a negotiated peace, that new German weapons under development would reverse the tide of the war. This self-deception persisted even as evidence of defeat accumulated. By summer 1944, Allied air superiority over France was absolute. German ground forces attempting to resist the Normandy invasion discovered what it meant to operate without air cover. American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs attacked German tanks, trucks, and troop columns with impunity. German soldiers who had spent years fighting with Luftwaffe support suddenly understood the terror that Polish, French, British, and Soviet soldiers had experienced in earlier years. The Luftwaffe still existed. It still had aircraft. It still had pilots willing to fly and fight. But it no longer controlled German airspace. American and British bombers flew when weather permitted. German fighters intercepted when fuel permitted. The initiative had shifted completely to the Allies. Speer understood this reality better than most German leaders because his responsibilities forced him to confront material facts rather than ideological wishes. As Minister of Armaments and War Production, he received daily reports on industrial output, transportation capacity, raw material supplies, and labor availability. He could not ignore evidence that contradicted his preferences because the numbers were undeniable. By May 1944, Speer was warning Hitler that the bombing campaign against German synthetic fuel production threatened the entire war effort. Germany had limited access to natural petroleum. Most fuel came from synthetic production facilities that converted coal into gasoline through complex chemical processes. These facilities were large, expensive, and extremely vulnerable to bombing. On May 12, 1944, American bombers struck the Luna synthetic oil plant near Leipzig. The attack was devastatingly accurate. 60% of the facility was destroyed. Speer later wrote that this date marked the decision of the technological war. Germany would never recover from the systematic destruction of its fuel production capacity. The Americans had discovered Germany's critical vulnerability. Throughout summer 1944, Allied bombers hammered German oil production. Raids struck synthetic fuel plants, refineries, and storage facilities. By September, German fuel production had collapsed to 15% of January levels. The Luftwaffe, the Wehrmacht, and the Kriegsmarine all faced severe fuel shortages. Fighter aircraft sat on the ground because there was no fuel to fly them. Newly produced tanks remained in factories because there was no fuel to deliver them to frontline units. Submarines remained in port because there was no fuel for patrol operations. The German military was being immobilized not through lack of equipment but through lack of fuel to operate that equipment. Hitler's response to this crisis revealed the depth of his disconnect from reality. He blamed Speer for defeatism. He blamed Göring for incompetence. He blamed German fighter pilots for cowardice. He refused to acknowledge that American industrial capacity had simply overwhelmed German resources. In staff meetings, Hitler continued to discuss plans for new offensives, for secret weapons that would reverse the war's trajectory, for political divisions among the Allies that would lead to negotiated peace. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 demonstrated both German military capability and German strategic delusion. Hitler scraped together every available tank, artillery piece, and combat-ready division for a surprise attack through the Belgian forests. The offensive achieved tactical surprise and initial success. American forces were pushed back. Towns were recaptured. For a few days, it seemed possible that German arms could still achieve local victories. But the offensive consumed the last reserves of fuel that Germany possessed. Tanks ran out of gasoline and were abandoned. Supply trucks could not keep pace with advancing units. Within 2 weeks, the offensive had stalled. American reinforcements arrived. Allied air power, grounded initially by weather, returned to the battle. By January 1945, the German forces were retreating with catastrophic losses. The Ardennes offensive accomplished nothing strategically except to accelerate Germany's defeat. The fuel, ammunition, and troops expended in Belgium could have been used to defend Germany itself. Instead, they were wasted in an offensive that had no realistic chance of changing the war's outcome. Hitler had gambled Germany's last reserves on a fantasy and lost. This was the context in which Speer watched 1,000 American bombers approach Berlin on February 3, 1945. Everything he had warned about had come to pass. German fuel production was negligible. Transportation networks were collapsing under continuous bombing. Industrial output was falling precipitously. The Eastern Front was less than 100 kilometers from Berlin. The Western Front was approaching the Rhine River. Speer's diary entry that evening was bleak but accurate. He calculated that German war production would cease within 4 to 8 weeks. Not because factories had been destroyed, though many had been, but because the transportation system that connected raw materials to factories and finished products to military units was disintegrating under continuous air attack. Coal could not reach steel mills. Steel could not reach weapons factories. Weapons could not reach frontline units. Even factories that survived bombing could not operate if they received no coal and could not ship their products. The entire industrial system was suffering systemic failure. Other German leaders reached similar conclusions at different times through different paths. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in France before D-Day, had recognized by spring 1944 that Germany could not win. He had proposed negotiating with the Western Allies before the military situation became desperate. His proposals were rejected. After the failed July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler, Rommel was forced to commit suicide. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most senior commanders, privately acknowledged to staff officers that the war was lost. But he continued to execute Hitler's orders because he saw no alternative. Rundstedt represented the professional Wehrmacht officer class, men who understood military reality but felt bound by oath and tradition to continue fighting. General Heinz Guderian, chief of the German General Staff in the war's final years, tried repeatedly to convince Hitler to withdraw forces from hopeless positions to create strategic reserves. Hitler refused every request, insisting that every meter of territory must be defended. Guderian's frustration was evident in staff meetings, but he lacked the authority or courage to openly defy Hitler. The tragedy was that many German military leaders understood they were losing but continued fighting anyway. They rationalized their actions through duty, loyalty, and fear. They convinced themselves that perhaps some miracle would occur. They focused on tactical problems they could solve rather than confronting strategic realities they could not change. This cognitive dissonance was not unique to Germany. Military organizations in every nation struggle to acknowledge impending defeat. Admitting that sacrifices have been in vain, that comrades have died for nothing, that defeat is inevitable, requires a psychological burden that few humans can bear willingly. But Germany's situation was unique in its combination of evident defeat and continued resistance. By February 1945, no rational assessment suggested Germany could win. The Soviet army was approaching Berlin from the east. Anglo-American forces were approaching the Rhine from the west. German cities were being bombed continuously. Fuel shortages had immobilized most military units. Industrial production was collapsing. Yet Hitler continued to issue orders for non-existent divisions to conduct offensives with non-existent fuel using non-existent air support. His generals continued to execute these orders, moving pins on maps that bore no relationship to battlefield reality. The entire command structure had become a theater of delusion, pretending that determination could substitute for divisions, that fighting spirit could replace fuel, that miracle weapons under development would somehow reverse 3 years of accumulated defeat. Göring's reaction to the war's final months was particularly pathetic. The man who had promised that no enemy bomber would reach Germany watched helplessly as Germany's cities burned. The man who had built the Luftwaffe into Europe's most formidable air force presided over its destruction. By 1945, Göring had largely withdrawn from active command, spending time at his estate Carenhall rather than at headquarters. When Soviet forces approached Carenhall in April 1945, Göring evacuated his art collection and personal possessions. He ordered the estate destroyed to prevent it from falling into Soviet hands intact. The demolition of Carenhall symbolized the destruction of Göring's ambitions and the Luftwaffe he had commanded. Göring's famous boast from September 1939 haunted him in the war's final years. He had declared that if a single enemy bomb reached the Ruhr, people could call him Meyer, a common German name. The statement was intended to demonstrate confidence in the Luftwaffe's defensive capabilities. Instead, it became bitter mockery. As Allied bombs fell on German cities, civilians sarcastically referred to air raid sirens as Meyer's trumpets. The psychological impact of continuous bombing on German civilians was severe. Early in the war, Germans had believed Göring's assurances. They had trusted that the Luftwaffe would protect them. When British bombers began attacking in 1940, civilians took shelter but remained confident that German defenses would eventually stop the raids. By 1944, that confidence had evaporated. Germans understood that their government could not protect them. They endured bombing because they had no choice, not because they believed German defenses would eventually prevail. The psychological contract between the Nazi regime and the German people, based on promises of security and victory, had been broken by visible evidence that fell from the sky every day. The February 3rd raid on Berlin killed between 20,000 and 25,000 civilians. Another 120,000 were left homeless. These numbers represented a single day's casualties from a single raid. Similar raids occurred repeatedly throughout February, March, and April 1945. The cumulative toll on German civilian morale was devastating. Speer noted in his memoirs that by February 1945, ordinary Germans no longer believed in victory. They continued working in factories, serving in civil defense units, obeying government orders, but they did so mechanically without hope or enthusiasm. The population was exhausted, traumatized, and increasingly convinced that their leaders had led them into catastrophe. This realization came too late to matter. By the time ordinary Germans understood that the war was lost, Germany had already committed crimes that would define it for generations. The Holocaust had killed millions. The invasion of the Soviet Union had killed millions more. German forces had occupied and brutalized much of Europe. These crimes could not be undone by late recognition that the war was unwinnable. The question that haunted German officers after the war was why they had not recognized defeat earlier and acted on that recognition. Some, like Speer, claimed they had understood but lacked the authority to change policy. Others claimed they had been deceived by Hitler and his inner circle. Still others simply refused to discuss the question, maintaining silence rather than confronting their complicity in obvious disaster. The reality was more complex than any simple explanation. German military and political leadership failed to recognize defeat because recognition would have required them to acknowledge that everything they had worked for, everything they had sacrificed, everything they had ordered others to sacrifice had been pointless. That psychological burden was too great for most to bear while the war continued. So they continued. They issued orders. They executed operations. They moved units on maps. They reported to higher headquarters. They maintained the appearance of competent military leadership even as the gap between their reports and reality grew wider each day. They became, in effect, actors in a performance of command rather than actual commanders making rational decisions. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.